First of all, 2 points I wanted to make, kind of two digressions before I start talking about Dorothy Day. One has to, by the way, if anybody's nervous about projection, I tested negative. I'm vaccinated, boosted, and negative that way. First of all, I wanted to talk about the nature of biography for a moment, because this is the first book I wrote in which the subject of, there were many people alive still, and still are, who knew the subject of the book. And that can be a very tricky thing. My previous book was about Archbishop John Hughes. It's called Dagger John. Archbishop John Hughes and the Making of Irish America. He's the prelate who founded Fordham and St. Patrick's Cathedral and fought the nativist Protestant bigots who were trying to subdue the Catholics in the 1800s. He died in 1864, so obviously there's no one around to say, well, you got that wrong, or that interpretation is not correct. An earlier book was about the village painter and socialist John Sloan. He died in 1951, so there were a few people left who knew him. And his second wife, who was 4 years younger, was around and very helpful with the book. But with Dorothy Day, it was a different experience. And I just want to say that so many people were so helpful, but necessarily writing about someone other people knew many years ago. She died in 1980. Involves conflicting ideas about biographical writing. It's perfectly understandable that people would say, well, that's not how I remember her, or I think you got that wrong. And of course I did hear that after the book came out. And or even people who had specific issues with the book. And why did you have to bring up so much about homosexual, gay men and lesbians and their involvement with the Catholic worker, things like that. So my point about the real nature of biographical writing, though, is if we tend to think of it as this gathering of facts that's supposed to give an objective chronicle of a life, then we're completely off base with most biographies. And we're much better off if we think of it as closer to portraiture. So if you look at a painting by an artist, a portrait of someone, you're of course not saying that's exactly that person that relates to life. You're acknowledging that's the painter's view, that there's a subjective element involved. And certainly I do believe that, of course, all biographers have to be as fact-conscious as possible and ferret out as much information as possible, but elements of sort of informed inference, let's say, or even interpretation are important, and you're going to hear some of that inference and interpretation tonight. John Sloan, that painter, his first wife was a very possessive woman, and she always used to call him my John Sloan. He was my John Sloan. And I think biographers feel that way with their subjects as well. The book that I wrote was my John Sloan, not Mrs. Sloan's. And sometimes I felt this was my Dorothy Day, my portrait of her, necessarily subjective in some ways. The other quick digression I wanted to make before starting to talk about the Dorothy of the book. I don't know, you might have seen in December in the New York Times, there was a celebratory mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral led by Cardinal Dolan. And this was to celebrate the fact that all the materials from the archives had finally been gone through and boxed and were ready to be sent to Rome, where she's been considered for canonization. So at the mass at St. Patrick's, they had these many boxes ready to go. Now I was not able to attend that night, and so I'm relying on the memories, the comments of people who were there, as well as the Times article. But there was some questioning afterward. It also goes to this question of subjectivity. According to some people who were there, the Cardinal spoke about Dorothy's early life in one regard. And in fact, used the word promiscuous, which some people took issue with. And I don't know, could we agree? Promiscuous is a very iffy word. I prefer freewheeling, libidinous, promiscuous, a highly subjective word. And they also felt that he didn't quite acknowledge her concern for social justice even before her conversion. There was some sense that there was a talk about a wayward life, a promiscuous woman, and then she found God, the Catholic Church, and she became this other saintly figure. So, understandably, not everybody was comfortable with that take on Dorothy Day, and nor am I comfortable with that either. So that just brings us back to, okay, whose Dorothy Day is this? And that's one thing we're going to consider tonight. So, first of all, how does a woman born in 1897 to a conservative Republican family, a middle-class family that has all the prejudices of their time and class, especially her father. Her mother sort of went along with her father, born in the South originally, but then he's living up here in Brooklyn where she's born, then San Francisco, then Chicago, back to New York. Her father has disdainful attitudes toward people of color, toward immigrants, toward Jews, toward political radicals, and the family has no interest in religion whatsoever. I think that's kind of interesting. How does someone who was from that background, that rather extreme background, and become later the most ardent advocate for the homeless in the history of the United States, in my view, a passionate pacifist, vehement critic of American foreign policy, of unfettered capitalism, a believer in civil disobedience and civil rights, and undoubtedly one of the most progressive people in America in some ways. Highly critical of what she saw this society becoming. I mean, to digress for another second, even in the 1920s, she worried, what are the real gods of American society? What does Americans really worship? And this is before she herself has found her way to the church at all. She said, they seem to worship security, stability, affluence, innovation, and technology. And I remember reading that thinking, this woman was certainly onto something. The god of technology, the god of innovation, the god of affluence. This concerned her long before she became Dorothy Day in some ways. So back to that question, how does a woman from that background become who she is? Well, how does anybody become who they are? We have models, we have anti-models, we have the matters of temperament and context to consider. And I think sometimes we stress models too much. Young people need models of what they might be in life. I think the anti-models are especially important. Because Dorothy Day, I mean, how many of us actually looked at our parents and said, that's not what I want. That's not what I want. That was certainly the case with Dorothy Day. The extreme prejudices and narrowness of her father, whom she loved, but found very disappointing, were, I think, a profound influence on her. So that her mother was sort of a mystery to her. She would say to her mother, well, other kids at school go to church on Sunday, or their families pray from the Bible. There were things called denominations, and her mother's like, we don't need to know about any of that anyway. So her mother was a little frustrated in that regard. But her father was downright bigoted. In fact, he said to her one time, don't talk to me about Catholics. Catholics, they're all Irish maids and cops. That's all, and we're not cops and we're not Irish maids, so don't bring up Catholics. Little did he know. This is the beauty of life that way. In fact, she had siblings. The two boys pretty much followed the father's thinking about life, and especially the older one, John. All the prejudices of his father he accepted. Interesting that her sister Della became politically quite liberal and picketed for Sacco and Vanzetti in the 20s, which certainly did not please John Day, Papa. And the youngest brother, John, became a member of the Communist Party in the 30s, which certainly did not please the father. So, although interestingly, he thought his daughter, Dorothy, what she got involved with later, was beyond any of that, was beyond understanding. And I think actually he was onto something. Because in some ways her story is one that is far larger than left-wing politics or concern for social justice. So we have, of course, this obviously a very intelligent young woman, and in adolescence a fairly restless one. That's one thing that's fun in biography is to try to read everything the person you're writing about read, so you get some sense of what they're all about that way. And it makes perfect sense that she would read people like Jack London, Upton Sinclair. She's reading progressive left-wing radical writers who are critical of American society. The more her father goes on about, the world of Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, that's the best of all worlds, and that's what we have here in America, if we can keep those dark people in their place and those immigrants out and those radicals silenced. So it makes perfect sense she's reading in that direction. All rebellious, smart adolescents read what their parents don't want them to read. That makes perfect sense. Likewise, when she was in college, 2 years at the University of Illinois, Finding the Russians, reading Tolstoy, and especially Dostoevsky, Gorky, and Chekhov, that all makes sense in a way. One thing that struck me as incredibly interesting, though, in an adolescent, someone in her mid-teens, She's reading Thomas de Quincey. Now, Thomas de Quincey is, I think, in general, not known to anybody nowadays. I mean, his book, Confessions of an Opium Eater, used to be around in bookstores, and that would be about it. But she was fascinated. She said, actually, the writer who made her more than Upton Sinclair, or her beloved Jack London, or even for a time her beloved Dostoevsky, was Thomas de Quincey. And I think there's a first clue to who she's becoming. His essays cover a wide range of topics, but you could say that Thomas de Quincey was somebody who was most interested in intensity of experience. Everything he writes about is about not leading or wanting a settled, known, middle-class, comfortable, respectable life. The William Blake phrase, what is that phrase? The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. That's Thomas de Quincey. Excess is good. Losing yourself is good. Experiencing the fringe in life is good. And this is potent stuff for a girl. She was in Chicago at that time, reading. They were assigning this at the high school in Chicago in 1912, not by a long shot. And this is in some ways a marker for me in some ways, because this is not just someone who feels rebellious about her parents' values. This is someone who is developing a sense that there's something off with the whole thing, in a way. And when she goes to college, she hears Elizabeth Gurley Flynn come and talk about socialism. She hears mention of the magazines, the masses in New York. She understands there's this other world out there of political activism. And she also starts to realize there's also this religious world out there. I've met people for whom religion is important. What is that all about? Why has my family never told me anything about that? Interestingly, she said at the time, I threw myself into political activism to keep myself from thinking about the religious dimension of things. I did not want to think about that. That was more complex and troublesome than I wanted. I had a curiosity about it, but I knew that was in some ways distressing to me. So we have to hang on to that thought in a way. And so she does become very political for a time in college. She leaves college at the end of 2 years. One other thing to say about those college years, though, is very telling. She had a capacity, even in adolescence, to want to see, this is very untypical of any adolescent or anyone from the middle class, to want to see how much deprivation she could endure, how much stoicism. This is in somebody who's 17 years old. How much stoicism can I endure? So, for instance, she was a scholarship kid to college. The family did not have enough money to send her to college, and very little to send her for extra money. So she had to work while she was at the University of Illinois. She would take the most grueling jobs and find rooms in the most awful homes where get an unheated room, do the family's laundry, look out for the baby, try to walk across the frozen waste of the campus to get to your classes, come back. I find this strange in a way. I find this, a 17-year-old girl, she could have found other jobs. She could have found better lodgings. It was a desire to test her mettle that way. It was a part of her temperament. It was part of her character. Long before this has anything to do with the Catholic worker, of course, and long before she moved to New York. So her parents moved back to New York, where the father's a journalist. He's worked at papers around the country, and he's got a job in New York. She decides, I think I want to go to New York with my family, and new adventures, new life. I'm adventurous. College life is not so interesting for me after 2 years. So she comes back here. She decides she would like to be a journalist herself. She definitely has an interest in writing. She definitely has an interest in literature. She's a remarkably well-read young woman for someone who is 17, 18, 19. She has this ridiculous idea that her father's going to help her find a job on a newspaper in New York, when, of course, he's not doing that at all. She began to suspect after enough doors were closed in her face that actually he was calling up editors of papers and news. And when your daughter comes by, you say, absolutely no, we're not winning, we're full up. Why don't you try, one suggestion, maybe if you go to a small town in New England, a little paper there in mind. And she began to suspect this was her father's voice. And she said, small town in New England, no, New York, this is exciting, this is where I want to be. And so she goes downtown and finds a job, walks into the Call, which was a ramshackle building on Park Road near City Hall. It's a very left-wing paper. It pays very badly, and everything about it is pleasing to her. It's left-wing politics. The writers there are a rowdy bunch, talented, radical people. She said at the time everybody was working on a play or a novel. But then there was this one guy, he'd go off on a bender for 3 days, and there was another one who was a compulsive gambler, and he'd come back after he'd lost everything, and they wouldn't ever fire them because they're too talented as writers. And she thought, this is great. These are the people I want to be. And of course, the people, the Day family is horror-struck, our daughter. And her father said to her, you're not living with us in the apartment on the Upper East Side if this is the kind of life you want. And so she then found a very poor apartment on the Lower East Side, with the bathroom not even in the house, but in the backyard, and began to work for Paul. And it was exhilarating to her in many ways. She was sent, the editor, Justice Wright, liked her a lot. The editor of the Woman's Page, Anita Block, was a character. I really wish we need a biography of Anita Block. So she's a favorite of mine. She comes up with so many contexts. She read the Woman's Page. All right, we all got the John. Usually the pictures of Dorothy Day, she's old, she's got white hair, she's in braids. So we opted for a slightly more jaunty one here. My co-author, Blair Randolph, didn't completely like her, she was too jaunty. No, she was jaunty. So Anita Block kind of liked her. She was editor of the Woman's Page. Anita Block said, mine was the only woman's page that never printed a fashion tip or a recipe. So those are the kind of people Dorothy was around. Anita Block sent her on all kinds of interesting assignments to cover radical speeches being given by Rosa Pastor Stokes or Elizabeth Gurley Flynn to go. She asked him to go interview Leon Trotsky when he arrived in New York. Now, the fact that Trotsky spoke no English and Dorothy spoke no Russian, Anita Block was an enterprising woman who will figure out something to do here. So somehow she did get an interview published in the Call. She also shared with the Call the anti-militarism when World War started in 1914, and she's writing with them. She shares those values as well. A famous picture of her is with two other protesters holding up the paper urging America not to get involved in the war. So she's actually beginning now this first phase of her life in New York. And I should have said at the start, actually, a talk with Dorothy Day in the Village is necessarily going to involve two talks. One is going to be about her days in the late teens and early 20s, in the late 19-teens and early 1920s, when she is leading this promiscuous but roustabout, freewheeling, libidinous life and politically active life. But then there's a second part, which we will also get to, much, much later. Dorothy Day in the Village also is about the woman who began the Catholic worker movement. And while it's largely associated with the Lower East Side, the first house of hospitality she opened, which is a whole wild story in itself, was actually on the corner of Charles Street in Washington. And this was like no other shelter for homeless people that ever existed or had been thought of. It has nothing in common with the settlement houses, with the Salvation Army, or the city shelters, as we will see. But this was in the village, in the West Village. So there is Dorothy Day in the Village as the Catholic activist, the devoted advocate for the homeless. So that's to come. Okay, how we doing? Okay. All right, so she's in this wonderful milieu that we all mythologize and romanticize somewhat. Who wouldn't want to go back in time to the village in the 19-teens? And of course, I get to know Eugene O'Neill too, and so on and so forth. But she is actually seen as, she's very young, she's attractive in some ways, she's enterprising, she does find a place, a definite place in this world. She becomes friends with a woman named Peggy Baird. I think of Peggy Baird as kind of like the Sally Bowles of the village at the time, in a way. So Peggy Baird's a painter. According to one source, she paints Dorothy nude at one time. Cardinal didn't mention that. Peggy was married to the free verse poet Warwick Johns, first husband. Peggy's my husband. Second husband will be Malcolm Cowley, the famous literary critic, literary historian, and mythologizer of the village in that day. She's also the woman who has the affair with Hart Crane, who's gayer than I am. And he right before he committed suicide in 1930, jumped off that boat in the Caribbean. So Peggy Bear is kind of a character in and of herself. She and Dorothy become very friendly. So that just tells us something about Dorothy's openness to these outre people of whom Peggy Bear was one. Peggy Bear also says to her, we have to go down and picket the White House for suffrage. And Dorothy's not terribly interested in suffrage. Actually, her politics are a little more radical. She probably has more in common with Emma Goldman, say, who is saying, you know, the vote isn't going to change that much. It's middle-class women who think that it's going to reform America in any major way. It's not. So Dorothy's not terribly interested in suffrage. But this sounds like a good radical thing. It sounds like it's going to drive her parents crazy, and Peggy wants to do it. So she does go down to Washington and join the Sentinels outside the White House, and gets arrested and thrown into the workhouse down there. It's a very traumatic experience. The women are terribly abused. We all know that whole story of the early suffragists and the force feeding and so on and so forth. She's when she gets to the workhouse where they put them up for a time, it's really a very foul place. I mean, she's pushed by one guard over the chair and grabbed by another, and she actually, now, I refer to her as the most passionate pacifist early. Well, that's a little later, because she actually bites the hand of the warden who smacks the guard at the time. Never again will she be that physical, but at the time she was quite angry. She and Peggy, eventually they started letting him out of the prison by degrees, but it was a horrifying experience. And she and Peggy took the first. Some of the women said, we're going to stay here to make a point, we want the press to make a good deal of this. She and Peggy got out at the earliest opportunity. She said, we ran to the Union Station, we bought a pack of cigarettes, terrible smoker, and had a big roast up dinner and got on the train to New York. But that was life in the village at the time for her. She also met somebody on that trip who was very important to the telling of her story. Charles Phillips, who went by the name Charles Shipman when he was a member of the Communist Party and they needed aliases. And he wrote a book, it was published in the 90s, called It Has to Be Revolution, Memoirs of an American Radical, which I don't know that anybody writing about Dorothy Day ever made use of that book. And it's really, it was really a very helpful source to me because he admired Dorothy enormously. He thought, this is a girl with such spunk, with such moxie and intelligence and cleverness, and he admired her enormously. He insisted they never had an affair, though he didn't find her attractive. He was engaged at the time. He got her involved with the Collegiate Anti-Militarism League when she came back here to New York. So she's done with the call now, and she hasn't started writing for the masses, but she's writing for this Columbia-based anti-war group uptown, doing secretarial stuff, and very committed to it. And his remarks about her in that memoir are very vivid. He talks about the fact that they would go out to the Lion Saloon on West 110th Street and have the lunch there and get totally bombed. And he described her at the time as pasty-faced and impishly irreverent, with a great generosity. And this is a man who likes her, obviously. And he said she was also very ribald. She would tell jokes about priests, nuns, sexual adventures that might well have been hers. So she was definitely a roustabout type who wanted to make an impression on people that way. But she said it was uncanny. They all had too much to drink at lunch at the Lion Saloon on West 110th Street. Go back to the office by Columbia University, and she was fine. She was ready to work. Another reason men at the time liked her. This is a woman with cold liquor. Around the same, so shortly after that, she meets Floyd Dell and some other writers from the Masses, which might be a magazine better known than The Call to most people. That's the most famous intellectual socialist monthly at the time. And she does get a job there. And now she's in the presence of so many intellectual and politically dynamic people. I mean, Floyd Dell's putting the moves on her in the office. Max Eastman's not there a lot. He's raising money for the magazine. Crystal Eastman ignores her. But she finds this an exciting milieu. It's also, take note, not remotely concerned with religion or anything religious at this time. Of course, it's promoting opposition to the war, opposition to Woodrow Wilson, it's promoting suffrage, it's promoting birth control. She's met Margaret Sanger and gone to her lectures in the 19-teens. Later, in the early 20s, when she's in Chicago, she's going to ask Margaret Sanger for a job at her office, which she doesn't have one, which is interesting, given the whole birth control thing and the complications there. So she gets a job on the Masses, and this introduces her to a whole other range of people, including then Eugene O'Neill and Mike Gold, the author of Jews Without Money, noted American communist later, who she actually met through the call. And they're very, very close. How close? He wanted to marry her at one time. She thought he might be suitable. It's probable. He had enormous respect for her, even after she became a devout Catholic. He was one of the few people who could take that and assimilate that fact about this woman, like most of her friends, as you can imagine, in the village. Most of her friends, I think I see my gun sometimes there, somehow. Dad's here. They'll come in with Mom. So, I've lost track where I was.
Did he assimilate?
Oh my God, so yeah, she's involved with these people, and these are passionate relationships, whether they were sexual or not is it's another matter. It almost doesn't. Did she have sex with him? No, not. I don't know that I really care. But they're very close for a year before his life goes off in another direction. They're also, and with my goal, she's extremely close. There was an aspect, though, in which I suppose we could use the word lost or the word wavered for these years, though. It's not all exuberance and political activism and meeting the smartest people you could want to meet. It's there's a point at which, and here we go back to Thomas De Quincey in a way, or we go back to the characters of Dostoevsky. I'm so fascinated where she does want, she's testing constantly in so many ways. Malcolm Cowley mentioned once that she came over to his apartment and met the poet, the gay poet John Loughery, whom Cowley had known at Harvard, and attempted to seduce him. At the moment, he said Loughery was looking for broadened horizons or whatever. Whether he got them or not from her, who knows? But Cowley also mentioned that there seemed to be something not joyous about Dorothy's connections with men at this time. Charles Phillips said the same thing, that he felt that she was so open that she was often hurt by men at this time. So I think we're also talking about someone who, in terms of, what other word? In terms of health, normality, middle-class ideas about how one's life should proceed, she's moving away from those, and she's in a different place entirely. And this is, enter Lionel Moise at this point in the story. Okay. Handsome, charismatic, definitely good in bed, a journalist. He worked for many papers across the country, including the Kansas City Star, where a young 18-year-old Ernest Hemingway met him. Hemingway, being Hemingway, insisted I wasn't influenced by him at all. Others at the Kansas City Star thought the whole macho thing that Lionel Moise exuded did influence young Hemingway in terms of a persona and a stance in life. I mean, everybody in often Kansas City knew he was seeing, Lionel Moise was seeing this woman at the time. He had a great car. He couldn't afford a car. He got from this woman that he was seeing, who then, in trying to bring him up and trying to stab him, he broke her nose. I mean, or that's Lionel Moise in a way. So he's what used to be called a womanizer. And women are very much attracted to him. But so are men, because he's this incredibly bold journalist going after the most. He was just at home in City Hall or on the wharfs and the docks with criminal types. He's appreciative of poets. He's friends with Malcolm Cowley, but he's also a very dangerous character in a lot of ways. This is what she attaches herself to. It was almost like free fall in a way. Certainly her sister and her mother said, from what you told us about this man, this is madness. He is very honest in one way. Lionel Moise said, I'm not interested in any woman I've ever been with. I've told her I'm not interested in marriage or babies. That's absolutely out of the question. If you get involved with him, you have to know that. He wanted women who were uninhibited sexually, who were willing to allow him to be completely dominant, and knew what they were getting into. Okay, so we're into strange territory here now. She knew all that, and she wanted her sister, who's a close friend of David, don't get involved with him. He has an apartment on West 14th Street. Steer clear of him, and that is who she commits herself to, totally, body and soul, to this man, who wants not only to be, and presumably their sex life must have been incredibly passionate. That seems to be the word about him, but he's also controlling in all sorts of other ways. Her reading is something which has always been vast. It's something he wants to control. She loves the novels of Joseph Conrad. He said, no more Conrad at all. Don't you dare bring the Conrad novel into them. These are my literary gods, Dreiser and Kipling and Twain. Those are the ones you may read. Once when they were in Chicago for a time, she's reading James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a young man on the subway. He grabs the book, throws it out the window, and that's the end of that. And this is all accepted by her. She's to know her place in the bedroom. She's to know her place in the kitchen. He'll monitor which of her old friends she will see. So, all right, what do we make of this? This is absolutely key. Some of the earlier writings about Dorothy Day like to play this down. It's nothing she talked about later to most people who knew her later in life. Why would she? She's afraid young people in the 60s, the people who are keeping the Catholic worker afloat, are going to say, well, Dorothy Day smoked marijuana. Dorothy Day had a lot of sex. Dorothy Day was this freewheeling rousing artist who can't die. That's the last thing anybody in the 60s needs to hear from a 7-year-old. So it's not something she wants to talk about, nor is it something she's necessarily proud of later. Charles Phillips even notices that when he sees her one day, that there are bruises on her. The man beats her. And this is not anything mentioned in any other books about it. In fact, more than one person who knew Dorothy Day said to me afterwards, I just find that hard to believe. The Dorothy Day I knew was so strong-willed, so independent, so intelligent and commanding. I cannot picture her allowing a man to hit her. I don't believe it. But of course, we have to remember the Dorothy Day you knew in the 60s and 70s is not the Dorothy Day of 1920. Which of us could look at our grandparents, if we knew them in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and say, oh, I know exactly what they were like at 20. We don't. We don't know at all about them. Now, this is sometimes been seen as a kind of black hole in her life, but it struck me the more I thought about this, and the more I read about her devotion, and it gets really bad. I mean, she becomes pregnant by him. Now, people knew where to get condoms in the village in 1920, 1921. He's obviously not interested in that. That's her problem to deal with that. She does go to Margaret Sanger's lectures. We know the situation about birth control and how hard it is anyway, but he has no interest in this. This is, again, like the other directives he's given her. This is her problem to deal with. She becomes pregnant, and he says, you know what I told you about this. By the way, I have a job. I've been offered a job with the Chicago Post, and I'm leaving. Good luck. And he leaves, as he told her he would if she became pregnant. That doesn't end her devotion to him in some ways. She follows him to Chicago and in effect begs him to take her back, which he doesn't. That's when Charles Phillips notices the bruises on her. She has an abortion in Chicago. She tells it in a different way in her autobiographical novel, The 11th Virgin. She cleans up the experience, describes it as happening with a woman doctor in New York. That wasn't the case at all. It was with Ben Reitman, who was an earlier lover of Emma Goldman, who was not the most hygienic person, whose medical practice was entirely serving those people who had venereal disease or prostitutes or so on. And so it's a horrendous experience. She says, I'm left on the table bleeding, and the man gets out as quickly as he can. And so this is, of course, heartbreaking. Finally, afterwards, she's able to let go of Lionel Moise, and he moves on to a paper in Milwaukee, and she tries to move away. So what do we make of this? This could indeed be seen now as two entirely separate stories. This is a woman who's lost, who will later be found when she finds religion and meaning in life. And yet, that's not the way I write about it in the book at all, and that's not the way I see it or believe it. So we go back to that informed inference and interpretation. My view of her being involved with Lionel is actually, I use that phrase, free fall before. Getting involved with something that, putting yourself in that kind of situation is, I think, she wanted now to go, talk about intensity of experience, she wanted to see what it was like to completely abase the sense of self. She wanted to see what it was like, and here we are, we're talking America. We've always been talking America. What's the most important thing? Your sense of self, your rights, your health, your personality, your place in a society where the whole world makes sense. But sense of self, and of course, in post-Trump America, this is now our mania, make America about me again. This, to her, I think she was looking to see what it was like. I'm smart. I'm as smart as anyone I know. I know Eugene O'Neill. I hang around the Provincetown Playhouse. I work for the masses. I have all these possibilities in life and interesting friends. I want to know what it's like not to be me, not to be Dorothy Day, not to feel a sense of wholeness and safety and give myself up to something. Now, of course, an incredibly unhealthy thing to give yourself up to an abusive man. But it nonetheless is a feeling of a complete emptying of the self. And indeed, I feel that is exactly what happens when she is converted to God. I mean, she's starting to pay more attention to religion all the time. While she'll spend the night with Eugene O'Neill at the Hellhole, the Golden Swan, on that little park next to McDonald's on 6th Avenue by 3rd Street, drink up a storm, hang out there with the tough guys and the gangsters who hang out there, and have a great time. And everybody loved her there, because of course she can drink them all under the table and sing dirty ditties and so on and so forth. But she tends to go early the next morning to St. Joseph's Church on 6th Avenue there, a block north, and she's not going, in my view, in a sense of repentance for having spent a bad night. She's going with a curiosity. What is going on in there? She stares at the people kneeling, praying. She listens to the music. She smells the incense. She sees how people look when they see the host, and it intrigues her. She has a sense that they're in tune with something she knows nothing about, the family's never talked about. There is this draw, in a way, which she acknowledges since college she's been fighting, not wanting to know too much about this. At the same time, she's being drawn to it. But she definitely is beginning to develop a sense of religion in America and what it means. And it seems to her most people in America say they're religious. I think it's the same way today. All those polls where 90% of Americans say they're religious. Well, what does this really mean? They go to church on Sunday, they pay their tithes, they say they believe in God, but has it in any way really changed their life radically in a massive, revolutionary way? Has it taken them out of their middle class notions and comforts? Well, not at all. And this is a woman then, anyone who could get involved in La Louise is interested in the fringe, is interested in an intensity of experience that is not normal in any way. And so she begins to read more about religion. William James, the writers of religious experience, is very important to her. She reads St. Augustine more. She starts, wherever she is, she's going to church. A friend gives her a set of rosary beads, and she's very pleased with it. She has no idea what does it mean exactly. But all of this is a draw to her. And it's certainly taking away from the gay family. Certainly taking away from very unreligious friends in the village. But it's also taking her away from how most of America actually approaches faith, approaches spirituality. I mean, now, of course, you can imagine that the village crowd said, well, there's Dorothy. She's always been a little wacky. And they also said things like, well, if you have to find God, can't you be an Episcopalian? I mean, that's something we could follow. Or better yet, a Unitarian? Catholic, you're going to Catholic churches? It's the most reactionary institution in the world. This was inexplicable to you. Why would you choose a Catholic church? And in some ways, why is she going to Catholic Mass instead of going to hear the Unitarians talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson or the Episcopalians, looking all like the British vicar? No, it's the mysticism, it's the inexplicable that she feels drawn to here in some ways. So there's so much more to her. There's so much more to her story this way. But by the mid-20s then, she has found the love of her life, Foster Batterham. That does not work out either. Obviously, Dorothy's luck with men is nil. He's a lovely person in so many ways and just what she wants, but he also is a free spirit. He does not believe in marriage. And he certainly doesn't believe in religion. So this is very distressing to her. She says, can't we get married? Can't we have a life? I won't force my religious views, and he wants no part of this. But they do have a child then, out of wedlock. She baptizes the child in the Catholic Church, hoping she won't be as lost as she has been. But she isn't ready fully for baptism herself. But that comes along not long after. And she feels, all right, I'm now trying to find that deeper thing I've been searching for all my life since adolescence. And I think I believe in God, and I believe in, of course, this is where we also have to, we go back to subjectivity. So hearing that somebody's found God and joined the Catholic Church, what does that mean to you when you hear that? Are you subjectively saying, well, that's unfortunate, and that's pretty conservative, and how could you, for instance, when I started going back to church, not because of writing about Archbishop John Loughery, after 50 years as an atheist, but because of Dorothy Day, my husband was a little disconcerted. Having found my faith from my youth by way of Dorothy Day. But I think she had a sense at first that I'm not joining an organization whereby I have to believe necessarily at this point. She thought, I don't believe everything in terms of their social and political views. I'm joining a community of the faithful, a community of believers. Likewise, maybe my notions of God aren't, remember St. Augustine said we shouldn't say God exists, because that automatically implies there's a being in a place and we're making it anthropomorphic. He suggested we should say God is real because that has a meaning, and we believe we should only talk about God in terms of metaphor or analogy, and not because we know everything about God. That all resonated with her enormously. So she becomes a Catholic herself. It isn't the wonderful experience that sort of was promised her by G.K. Chesterton, that she would now wait in the day of glory and feel. It's a number of years till she can actually find out, this doesn't mean anything. I go to Mass, I go to confession, I don't know, but I feel transformed in the way I want to, until she meets Peter Moore in the early 1930s. And this utterly strange. French vagabond intellectual, a man who believes in the New Testament, who believes in the Sermon on the Mount, probably more literally than any human being who's ever lived, who actually believes when Jesus said, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, and believes that's true, that we find the embodiment of God in every human being, no matter how foul that person is. Peter Moore believes this, and he believes when he finds Dorothy, he forces his way into her life. He said, I found you, and I'm going to lead you to your mission in life in a way. And she often said the Catholic Church never would have found it, and Peter Moore and then pushed his way into a kitchen and refused to leave until he was done talking, which was never. And, but he's the inspiration for the Catholic worker in the 30s, which starts with a newspaper, a very left-wing progressive religious newspaper, handed out at Union Square and then mailed around the country. Its peak, it reaches 100,000 people in 1940. And he also convinces her to open the houses of hospitality. So that's my last topic here. The idea of the house of hospitality, though, is so remarkable, is so revolutionary, is so out of anybody's normal middle-class experience that it could only have come about by way of Dorothy Day and Peter Moore. The idea was that unlike settlement houses, Jane Addams settlement houses, were in a good white liberal way helping these immigrants and giving them classes and doing all this do-gooder stuff. And certainly unlike the city shelters, or the salvation shelters, where you're made to feel you better be grateful for all this we're giving you, and you have to leave during the day, come back at night, and certify your impoverished state. The house of hospitality was supposed to be exactly that. I think the term was Peter Moore's. It's got to be a place where the people who are invited to live there, who are homeless, are made to feel they are guests in your home. You're not there to proselytize about religion. You're not there to give them duties or chores. You treat them as if you would a guest in your own home. And you don't close it out to anyone, because everyone is, in effect, God or embodiment of Jesus. And so she opens it in different apartments on the east side of 15th Street, where she's living at the time, and then she finds a place to rent. I think it was an 11-room, 4-story tenement in the corner of Charles and Washington. And this is the first one, before they moved to the Lower East Side, where we associate the Catholic worker movement today. And by any middle-class standards, it's a horror. Anybody, so it's one thing to say we want to help the homeless and bring in people and et cetera, et cetera. But what about the really homeless who lived on the street a long time and are truly damaged, who are not just don't have any money and smell poorly, but are also not mentally well? They were welcome as well. Anyone was welcome as long as there was any room there. And when her family visited, when priests and nuns who liked this idea visited, when other social workers visited, they were all somewhat horrified by the lack of order and organization. So why don't you have these people at least work in the kitchen or clean up? Well, I don't do that to guests in my house. I want these people to know how we feel about them. And we do not feel anything that smacks of condescension. And furthermore, we live here in voluntary poverty with them. We don't go home to middle-class homes at night and come back and help these poor, lost souls. We live with them. So anybody who volunteers, now that was a fun thing too about the book, finding out who are these people who, instead of going to college or after college, abandoned their family's dreams for them. And she found so many people in the 1930s and here who found their way to her. And so it was extraordinary. Think of committing yourself to so much hardship and poverty is in some ways a bedrock aspect of what the Catholic worker is all about. And to me, if you ever look into the book, it involves so many other dimensions. Her becoming more and more of an orthodox Catholic, the whole homosexuality thing is sort of interesting, her fights with the church over the Spanish Civil War and supporting Franco, her trying to find what's the line between the obedience I believe I'm called to give and where I feel the church is going wrong in some ways, was also quite intricate and a lifelong fight. But there was no question, in her lifetime, she was then seen as the most outspoken person, especially for pacifism, criticism of unfettered capitalism as well. Willing to go to jail if she had to, even as an older woman, all of which was respected by some members of the Catholic faith, especially nuns or priests who were willing to work in superstitions, considerably less respected by those in the hierarchy who felt she was a troublesome figure in some ways. And where is this all going to play out in terms of Pope Francis and her canonization? Who's to know? I would say her example today is still one that is threatening, because it calls for such an intensity of experience, such a revolutionary approach to religion. By the end, all along, I think she had really great reservations about priests who lived in well-appointed rectories and those who went to church on Sunday and said they were Catholic or Protestant or whatever, but whose lives hadn't been changed. Ultimately, this was what was one thing that was so impressive to me the more I learned about her. Ultimately, she said, this must be life-transforming, or it is not worth much of anything. You can call it religion, you can tell the pollster you're religious, but it must change something about how you see the rest of the world, how you act in the rest of the world, and if it doesn't, it's not real. So in that sense, I feel Dorothy Day is a figure in the village, in both her pre-Catholic and later Catholic experience, that is about a revolution in consciousness, far more than a political reform or social activism or anything else. It's about an entirely different outlook in life, which she was exploring from her adolescence on, and feeling the painful costs of in her late 20s, into her 20s, and how much she had to give up herself as she found her way to what she felt she was being called for, really all of her life, even before she moved. Should we do some questions? Anybody have questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions? Okay.
What would you say that today's society could take from her life and use?
Say it again, what would you?
What could today's society take from her life and use in our current situation?
Right. I think on a personal level, we all, every time I look at a homeless person, if I look at somebody asking for money on the street, I think differently than I did before. And I don't think, I think we need to see other people. It's so hard to let go. It's so hard for me. I'm a grudge-holding person. I'm a judgmental person. This is very hard for me to learn to think differently about people. So just in that individual realm. I mean, of course, in terms of society, or church, or whatever. I mean, Jesus. Cardinals are princes of the church. Popes live in palaces. But on a personal level, I think we can just begin to see other people differently and perhaps make a contribution. Now, the other thing to mention, when she would give lectures around the country, people by the 50s, when America's out of the Depression and things are going better, people would say, well, what do you think? Cockroaches and dirt and mice are somehow holy, that God loves people more if they live the way you do? And she would go the way to say, which is very wise, no, I don't think cockroaches and dirt and mice are particularly holy, or God loves those who live among them. I think, though, everyone must find his or her own level of commitment to the cross, as she would put it. And that makes sense. It's not as if we all have to go live in a Catholic worker house of hospitality. It's not as if we have to all give away every penny we have. But we must find our own level of commitment. And that commitment must involve some change, must hurt a little. That's what's needed. Yeah.
Did her daughter continue her mission after her mother's death? And what remains of the...
So she died several years ago. The story of Tamara is also very painful in some ways. I mean, it's a loving relationship, but it's also very difficult to raise your child in a house of hospitality amidst that level of disorder and chaos. And then her marriage, the daughter's marriage didn't necessarily work out. The family lived in great poverty, and eventually Tamara found her mother's piety too much and left the church, as did many of her grandchildren. So it was by the time she died in 1980, there's a closeness again, but it's a very pained relationship, and yeah, so all did not go well. But then, you know, some people said, well, that shows the biographer showing what a bad mother she was, and that's feeling. I said, I didn't know that's what I was thinking. I mean, would I want St. Augustine for my father? Would I want St. Jerome for my father? Do I believe saints could possibly be good parents? It seems to me, or not saints, saintly people, holy people, people committed to that, be good parents? No, I don't think the two things are remotely possible. Being a good parent is part of the normal, the middle class, the respectable, the sensible, etc. What she was doing was not normal, middle class, sensible, or respectable. It was something else, something almost transcendent, and children are necessarily going to get caught in the crossfire there.
Did she develop any kind of critique of communism and socialism because of this atheist outlook?
Yes, so she never, interesting, after getting arrested, fighting for suffrage, or picketing for suffrage, she never voted in her life, ever. Even when we finally got the vote, she didn't think this was a very big deal. Electoral politics, no. Socialism, again, it's more and more she cared. She's more an anarchist than a socialist. I think she felt all of these are reforms that aren't going to do enough. Now, the communism thing is interesting because she said, say what you want about the communists, and there was much to say that she knew about Stalin and how awful that he was. But she never wanted to come out and completely criticize because she said, they're at least showing some interest in the poor. They're at least they're in the 30s. Who is speaking up for the Scottsboro boys and about racial injustice in America? The Communist Party is very involved, so she didn't want to slam them. She felt there's much that's wrong about them, and I don't think we should criticize them as if capitalist America is doing so much about racial justice or poverty. And that was a sore point with the church, and still is. We'll see how that will affect the canonization. When she went to England, and late in her life, she went to the cemetery in Highgate where Karl Marx is buried. The young man who brought her there. She told him to steal some flowers from that grave over there and put them on Karl Marx's grave. So she had a place in her heart for the Marxists, even though she felt they're wrong, and their atheism, she said, is where they're really wrong. Yes, it was difficult. And the Spanish Civil War, where the Pope is insisting to support Franco because the communists are representing the Republicans, that's where she lost enormous support. Half the subscribers of Catholic Workers stopped. She said Franco's as bad as the left-wing revolutionaries in Spain. The only moral position is to support neither side, and the church was emphatically on Franco's repressive right-wing side, and that lost her a lot of support, and many people got very angry at her. So she didn't want to condemn the communists until we were as good about racial justice and poverty as they were going to be.
I'll elaborate a little bit about over the FBI.
Sure. By 1940, when they're going to start a draft before the war, she testifies before Congress that this is not a good idea. There shouldn't be a draft. If you institute a draft, it automatically means you're going to war. She's speaking up for conscientious objection, which the church is not, which the church is opposed to at that time. It's not until John the 23rd, the Catholic Church says conscientious objection is immoral and should be allowable. So even the church doesn't want to. So she's speaking up in the other direction. And indeed, they hid the conscientious objectors out of the Catholic worker if the FBI came looking for them. So her passage is very clear. And that's when her FBI file gets started. Hoover initially put her down in whatever category A. If it comes to war, she's to be one of those interned. Bad news, that one. Then he sent all his agents to the Catholic worker houses around the country, checked their bank accounts, etc. He couldn't get enough evidence to say she was a communist, but she's not a communist. And he put her into the category B. We just watch her carefully. So she had an FBI file, so which got released later. So yeah, Hoover thought she was, beyond pale, just another communist. She couldn't even hear the nuances of her views were certainly lost on him. So.
Did she have any interaction, or much interaction with the cardinals and traditional hierarchy in the New York Catholic Church?
Did she?
Did she?
Well, in some ways, yes. Cardinal Dolan said to me at the time I interviewed him with the book, of course, he said any prelate would be crazy to get involved in some critical way with the Catholic work, or they're just now, etc. And indeed, at the start, Cardinal Hayes was uncomfortable with what she wanted to do, but they let her do it. And how are you going to tell a woman who wants to start a newspaper about the poor and the homeless and those being evicted from their homes and the depression? They tell her, no, that's a bad idea. But they were uncomfortable with the direction she was going in. A couple of times, relations with Cardinal Spellman were very dicey. He knew he wanted to keep good relations in a way. I think he thought she should be shut down. But he knew if I shut them down, at one point he said, you've got to take the name Catholic off the worker. And everybody at the office was, this was in the 50s, everybody at the office was, this is outrageous, this is outrageous. Digging your heels. And so it was typical for her as an Orthodox Catholic who actually believes in obedience to authority. That's part of the spiritual exercise. So that's another thing that kind of gets us riled in our subjective way, obedience to authority. But as a spiritual exercise, it can make sense, not always insisting, I'm right, this is my view, and that's it. So she wanted to follow that. So she wrote a kind of obsequious letter to Cardinal Spellman. I'm sure we haven't offended as often as you think, and you do whatever you want, etc., etc. And of course he read the thing and said, oh, forget it. And so that was it. Whereas the staff wanted her to give it to him, I think she knew this letter was going to get her exactly what she wanted, and he'd back off. I mean, really, she had them in quite a difficult place. To close down the Catholic, tell them they came to this paper, was to look as if you were not interested in poor people, racism, etc., etc. Although, indeed, there were a few, interesting, in the Midwest were the bishops who most supported her. Bishops from Ohio, Wisconsin, so that area is very supportive. She spoke out, was invited to speak there a lot. The others were, even in New York, it kind of varied in some way. St. John's University, the Vincenzans, they told any students you distribute the Catholic organization here on campus, you're out. And other parishes welcomed her. So it depended on how liberal or how orthodox and conservative the individual priest or Monsignor was. But the hierarchy was always very uncomfortable about her, especially by the time you got to the McCarthyite 50s and so on. And she's so outspoken. The one time she actually came out blatantly and harshly in the Catholic worker, after Cardinal Spellman went to Vietnam and he spoke to the troops, he said, fight on to total victory. At the time, Pope Paul is urging negotiated settlement of the war, and he says, you're fighting evil, you're fighting communism, kill every one of those communists. And on the way back, he stops to visit Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, Christian souls on the way back. She wrote in the Catholic Worker her strongest remark. She said, sometimes words are as, I forget the adjective, words are as painful, as deadly as napalm. And he knew what she meant, and everybody knew what she meant. That's the strongest criticism she ever made without mentioning his name. So that's, again, how clever she was. She was horrified that he would go to Vietnam and urge the troops to kill, and it's not stop till they were done killing. No one thought about it. Interesting, I was listening to one of the tapes in the LBJ archive, and there's a phone call from Spellman to LBJ after he got back, and Spellman's trying to get an invitation to lunch with LBJ. I said, well, good work he did in Vietnam. And then the president brings up the Pope, and Sloan's trying to say, well, Pope doesn't really mean that. It's just so. Someone's working on a biography, a very reputable scholar from University of Massachusetts, working on a new biography of Cardinal Spellman. So I think that will be very interesting, because he's not the kind of person to whitewash this reactionary person. Maybe I'm being unfair. How judgmental I was about Cardinal Spellman, but she was pretty angry then. However, when people went to then picket and protest at St. Patrick's after Spellman got back from Vietnam, she refused to have any part of that. She said, no, we're not disrespecting. She would have been horrified to act up thing in 1989 where they invaded the church because the church's stance about AIDS and people were horrified by that. So no, we're not doing that. We're not interrupting the mass. We're not desecrating the cathedral. But I said what I had to say. So it's interesting though, when that book came out just for the lockdown, I sent 130 letters and press releases of the book to parishes in the 5 boroughs of New York saying I'd be available to talk, not a book selling event, just to talk about Dorothy Day to anybody in your congregation who would be interested. I heard that from two pastors out of 130 in the 5 boroughs. So I felt, so the question is, what's your view of her today in that regard?
You've got 5 minutes if you want to take one or two questions.
I guess on that point, in your interviews and maybe even in your personal opinion, like where do most people stand on her canonization?
Where do people stand about her canonization? Oh, that's an interesting point too. So you've got those who are very, you've got the sort of people within the organization of the church who are for it, although it's yet to be sifted through what they're going to decide. A great book by Kenneth Woodward is called Making Saints. It tells you just how incredibly involved, intricate, and expensive the process is to become saint. Then, of those who knew her, those connected to the Catholic worker, you have many people who look forward to this and feel she is a model of saintliness and holiness that would be inspiring. You have others, including some members of her family, who are afraid this will sort of homogenize, make her less radical in many ways. My own view, well, and when I started out, I thought I should have no views. The biographer shouldn't have a view on this particular topic because it will come across as special pleading and keep your own biases out. Then I went to thinking, well, for gosh sakes, if they're going to make Pius XII and John Paul II a saint, then she should be a saint. So I went to that with my next thinking. And now where I am in my thinking is that the church should, there should be a hiatus on all considerations of who is a saint or who is venerable until the moral lapse of the pedophile scandal is completely behind us. I think the church has no business saying who is. Although I accept and respect the view of those who say she's worthy to be considered a saint. If that would inspire anybody further, that's good. But I'm just sufficiently alienated from the hierarchy in the Curia at the moment to not want them to say who is favored of God, as if you should know. Great. Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about her views on homosexuality?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic too that I have to say that I don't think came up in enough books otherwise. So here, Dorothy in the Village in the 20s, she knew gay people. She socialized with gay people. She had dinner with the great painter Charles Demas, whom I love, gay man in the Village. She was with him in a restaurant one night when somebody at the table died of a heroin overdose. She knew gay people had no problem with that issue. By the time she becomes a Catholic, though, she starts to believe that one should follow church thinking. So in the 30s, 40s, and especially in the 50s, she adopts the church line. And there are some harsh responses. This is a certain thing we shouldn't even talk about. This is a sin. This is a great moral lapse. She's of that view, and yet it kind of corresponds with her feelings about abortion also. When a woman who joined the Catholic Order for a long time said, I have to let you know I had an abortion when I was young, and Dorothy said, no, you be with us, do good work. This is not, even though she was totally for abortion. Yet as times change, as she ages, other elements come in a way. There was a wonderful story about 2 guys up from the city at Tivoli, the farm they had upstate, and wrestling shirtless in the sun. Somebody pointed out to her, she says, T.H. Lawrence knew all about that. I remember the homoerotic wrestling scene in Men in Love. That was pretty nice. Also, there was a fellow I interviewed who lives in Minnesota now, who in his 20s, when he was a teenager, he came to the Catholic worker. Then he left, got married, and get a job. He came back in 1975, and he said to Dorothy, I do want you to know I want to work here, but I divorced my wife, and I know I'm gay now. You have to know that. And she just looked at him and said, I love you. And that was all she said. And they never talked about it again, but he felt welcomed. So I think, she also said that somebody made a snide remark about how many gay people there were at the Catholic Order in San Francisco. Well, somebody has to minister to them, she said. So that was good. And then there was a famous episode about a letter to the paper from a gay person who said, why don't you discuss violence against gay people the way you do other topics? And I think she was of many different minds. You know, we don't have to talk about every social issue, do we? I wish this never would come up. Oh, you people decide. So I think there was an understandable ambiguity there by the end that went with loving people and then having the church take its view. So it's not as if, when you say she was an Orthodox Catholic, it doesn't mean she was 100% in sync with every stage of the church. We have one last question.
Oh, I was going to ask, maybe you just answered it, but I was going to ask, what issue, if any, from the beginnings of the Catholic Order to the end of her life, do you think her views evolved on the most?
Yeah, I think, well, it's hard in a way, because her view of taking care of people was always what it was. So that part was the same. What she expected from people there also was very much the same. I think there was a remarkable consistency in some ways. Well, the sexual tensions brought in things that had to be decided. And she also had a period in the 40s of what would be called extreme piety in a way. At one point she went to know she fit in Mass twice a day. Now, once a day, that level of piety and sacrifice was off-putting to some members there. But I think possibly there was a greater generosity to people later after some more rigid periods of the 40s, 50s, 60s, potentially. But otherwise, she seems all of a piece once she found that place so far out from where all the rest of us live, spiritually as well as politically. That's where she was. That's why I think her life is unique in the annals of American history. American progressivism, American politics, American spirituality. I don't know anybody who's remotely out there with this young woman who's reading Thomas de Quincey and Dostoevsky and pressing herself to feel all the things that most of us try not to feel in our lives, to feel comfortable. Thank you so much for coming.